Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on the importance of a just transition to net zero emissions. I'm here with our host Samuel Baumgartner and Senior Climate Change Consultant Duška Šaža. Before I hand over to the experts, let me introduce you to the housekeeping information. As you may have noticed, you're currently muted. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the right-hand side bar and we'll answer them towards the end of the session. A few words on responsibility. We are a leading impact asset manager specializing in private market investments across 3 different investment themes: financial inclusion, climate finance, and sustainable food. We manage almost $5 billion in assets across 280 portfolio companies in 75 countries. And now over to you, Duška and Samuel.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Francisco, for the introduction. A very warm welcome to all the attendees. Thank you for taking the time to take a look at this topic with us. Obviously, also a very, very warm welcome to you, Duška. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Sam. I'm glad to be here again with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Pleasure as always. Today we'll discuss the importance of a just transition to net zero and what that actually means. But before we start, Duška, why don't you give a quick introduction of who you are so that the audiences participating in this webinar have a bit of a feeling of where you come from and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Duška Šaža. I'm a climate change consultant for over 16 years. I've been working on climate change from the very beginning on both pillars, so mitigation and adaptation. I've been working with many different organizations coming from public and private sector, and also encompassing various sectors within climate change, so energy, agriculture, forestry, etc. So I have, let's say, quite diverse experience when it comes to climate change, which I think is really necessary because of the complexity of the overall topic.
And you mentioned that the complexity, obviously, with the just transition, it's not just about getting to net zero, but it's also how we get to net zero. To start off, we would like to ask our audience a question as well, and we would like to ask you if you think each country should commit to the same requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And yeah, we're interested in your take on this. And in the meanwhile, you know, Duška, why don't you give us a quick definition on what a just transition actually?
So a just transition itself means transformation, so a process of transforming something. So in this case, in the context of net zero, transition would mean transforming the economy in a greener way. So basically greening the economy. The just part of the just transition means that this process is done fairly and including everyone, or basically leaving no one behind. In essence, it means that all the risks and the efforts and the rewards of the just transition should be equally distributed. That's, I would say, the core of a just transition.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I think in the meantime, we also have the results from the poll. So let's take a quick look at that. Interesting. I'm, to be honest, a bit surprised about the outcome that there's close to 70% of the attendees that think that the emissions should not be, they should not commit to the same requirements. Are you surprised by this outcome, or what were your expectations?
I'm not so much surprised, although I must say I was expecting a bit lower percentage when it comes to that, but that already tells that people are aware of different elements to this story, and that simply each country cannot have the same burden or the same responsibility. So obviously there is a certain level of awareness on this issue, which is very good. Very good.
Great. So we take it that there have been some thoughts around the topic. Maybe now jumping into the theme. When we look at the distribution of responsibilities, I think the historic context is very important. Could you shed some light why in this case as well? It's a crucial aspect that we need to take a look at when we talk about the just transition to net zero.
Absolutely. Correct. So the historical contribution to global cumulative GHG emissions, GHG meaning greenhouse gas emissions, is absolutely one of the most important parts. Why is that? Let me just start with a very simple point. The greenhouse gases, they, of course, we have different types of these gases. Once they're emitted into the atmosphere, some of them stay there for a very long period of time. So, for example, that very long period of time can mean a decade, can mean 100 years, but it can also mean thousands of years. Basically, what that means is the problem that we're facing now, the climate crisis that we're facing now, is not a problem that is created now. It's not a problem that was, created just recently. It's obviously, given the fact that we're talking about accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that we're talking about decades and decades of human activities and emissions that now form this GHG stock, so to call it, which creates this particular problem. In history, so we fortunately have information dating back up to 1850s, so around 170 years of data that shows, for example, which countries have contributed more or how much they have actually contributed to this GHG stock or cumulative emissions. And when we look at that data, for example, top 3 contributors to these cumulative emissions are United States, China, and Russia. These 3 countries alone have contributed with 40% to the overall global cumulative emissions throughout this whole period between 1850s up to 2021, let's say. Yeah.
So we definitely see that there's quite a bit of cleanup from the past also necessary, and you've mentioned some of the names like the US, Russia, the EU, and so on. Have we seen a shift over time on the level of contributions by other countries also sort of joining this emitters club, so to say?
Yeah. So these 3, I would say, they are the top ones in the whole period that I mentioned from 1850 to, let's say, 2021. And all of this contribution primarily came from carbon-intensive development, so fossil fuel related. But throughout this time, we can see different countries taking the lead. So, for example, the first 100 years from 1850 to 1950, Europe as a region was leading in terms of contribution to cumulative emissions, and UK was the country within Europe that really had the lead on that. Afterwards, UK stabilized its emissions, and then after 1950s up to 2005, let's say, USA took the lead, being number 1 global contributor to GHG stock. And around 2005, some other countries emerged, and then China took the lead over United States. So after 2005 onwards, China seems to be number 1 in contribution to cumulative GHG emissions. Yeah, so we can see a certain change in the main contributors over time. Yeah.
So we've been talking more from a geographical perspective or a geopolitical perspective of the emitters. We've been speaking about countries, but at the end of the day, it's human activity that creates emissions. It's us consuming, it's us driving. You've now just mentioned China taking the lead as the most emitting country in the emitters group. But China is also one of the most populous countries on the planet. How does this break down on an individual or on a per capita level when we then perceive it? Is there a shift in that, or how do we approach that?
Yeah, this is another layer of the whole, let's say, issue that needs to be taken into account. So we cannot just make a judgment on country level, what we just mentioned. So true, when we look at GHG emissions per capita, then the picture looks a bit different. For example, just to give a little bit of context before giving you certain numbers. So currently, global average GHG emissions per capita are around 4.4 tons of CO2 equivalent. Paris Agreement strives, or the objective is to halve that, so around 2.2 by 2030. So we're talking about 2.2 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita as an objective by 2030. When we look at GHG emissions per capita, the countries which have the largest number is actually those from a major oil-producing countries: Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, etc., etc. But their per capita can go up to 70 tons of CO2 per capita. However, they're less populated countries. So of course, this number is way higher. But if we look at more populated countries in the world, then the top, let's say, top emitters are, again, United States, Canada, and Australia, ranging between 15, let's say, and 17 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita, which is, again, 7-8 times more than what we strive to achieve by 2030. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have India, which has 1.7 tons per capita. We have African countries which are below 1. So they're completely on the other side of the spectrum. This is how things stand when we're talking about per capita emissions.
So obviously makes it a bit more complicated. Adding yet another layer to this, when we look at newspaper articles or reports, for example, here in Europe, everybody prides themselves of driving around electronic vehicles. We're reducing emissions as we go. We're making our buildings more efficient. But it also sometimes feels a bit of a maybe a bit of a fake, in the sense of these EVs or these materials are produced somewhere. So obviously they're not zero emissions. How do we differentiate in that narrative of what we use and where it comes from?
That's a very important layer that you just mentioned. And from climate change perspective, that actually relates to two GHG accounting approaches. One is called production-based approach, and the second is consumption-based approach. A production-based approach in calculating or estimating GHG emissions means that basically it accounts only for those emissions that come from the national production. So from activities or production that is happening within a country. It does not take into account the emissions associated to the production and transport, etc., of goods and services that are consumed in the country. They're not necessarily produced in the country, but they are consumed, and therefore this is the driver for that production. So this, in case that is taken into account, that's called consumption-based approach. Basically, it's adjusted for trade. And this is very important because there is, I'll give one example, Switzerland. Switzerland has 3 times higher consumption-based GHG emissions than production-based emissions. Basically, the living standard and the lifestyle means that there is a lot of consumption going on here, which is not necessarily also produced here. So production is outsourced somewhere else, driving production-based emissions for some other countries, as you mentioned. But if the consumption-based approach is not taken into account, then you don't get the full picture. So outsourcing the production somewhere else, because of in the, let's say, objective to keep the living standard, actually triggers emissions somewhere else. So we need to take that into account. In developed countries, the difference between production and consumption-based emissions is quite higher, which is expected. On the other hand, if we look at, say, African countries, then this difference is very small, because they don't have a very high living standard. The consumption patterns of course, are much different. So for them, the approach does not mean too much, but for the developed countries, it really paints a bit different, the whole picture.
Developed countries tend to also be the ones that generally have higher emissions from an overall perspective. So I think the aspect of a behavioral change there is also a crucial component when it comes to looking at the transition to net zero from an economic perspective. And with that, we would also like to know from the audience, we've gotten an agreement, or we've gotten an opinion for the first poll that not everybody shares, not everybody commits to the same level of greenhouse gas emission reductions. But for personal level, where would you be shifting hats the most to reduce your own personal greenhouse gas emissions, looking at your day-to-day life? And maybe also for you, Duška, where's the challenges for you? Where do you try to make the biggest shift?
So I would say the biggest challenges for me lie in the transport section and also buying goods. But I already, let's say, made a shift in that. For example, for transport, I completely rely practically on public transport within the city, for example. Or for business travel, I really aim to use trains or some other modes, except flights, with, of course, shorter distances. So only using flights for larger distances. And also in buying goods, I'm more kind of focused on the circular economy, what can be recycled, what can be reused, basically. So yeah, this is at least from my side. I don't know if you have other issues or maybe suggestions for me and for the audience.
Yeah, look, I mean, I face some of the similar struggles. For me, the most challenging one is definitely transport. I have family in Brazil. So there's an ocean in between. Taking a boat to go visit them, unfortunately, is not really a viable option. So in order to stay in contact with family and see them on a sort of regular basis, flying is unfortunately the only alternative. So I do hope that on the flying industry, there's some changes that come out to make flying more viable from a climate perspective as well. But I think definitely, for example, the dietary aspect is one that is, I would say, probably relatively easy for us to adapt. That you reduce dairy-based foods, more on plant-based foods. But I think you mentioned a very important part, also focusing on the type of products that we consume and looking at what can be reused, what can be repaired, what can be recycled, rather than basically to take it out and throw it away again. I think these are sort of the smaller things that can be implemented relatively easy in our everyday life.
Yep, true.
We get the results. There we go. Overwhelming amount of buying goods. I think there's general agreements both on the goods side and on the transport side. I guess as a second follow-up question, it would be interesting to hear what kind of diet most attendees are already pursuing. Maybe that's already sort of given the easiest part to change. I guess that's then also already been implemented and no longer something needs to be pursued. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the results?
Yeah, it's interesting to see 0% in the energy consumption, because the energy consumption primarily means housing. Yeah. So because I assume that people actually feel limited in that aspect. If they buy a house or a flat somewhere or live in a particular house, that they actually cannot choose their for example, electricity provider, or simply have in the market what they have in the market, depending on, for example, also which country they live in, etc. So this was a very interesting point, I have to say. But the buying goods and travel, I think the level of awareness in general is quite high, and people are becoming more and more aware. So that's something that I would say I was expecting in terms of the results. Yeah.
Great. So going back to the aspects of a just transition, we've looked at some of the historic aspects. We've looked at some of the different emission sources from consumption-based to production-based. But also, let's take a look at why it's so important to have a just transition. Why that?
So the importance of just transition is, as we said at the very beginning, having just a transition itself is simply not enough. So a transition to really, in the end, result in what we expect, so to full magnitude, and this is a radical change. It needs to be a just transition. Otherwise, it simply won't work, and it won't result in the overall impact that I would say we all aim for. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess we can expect that the burden is not going to fall the same on everybody, right? So it won't be evenly distributed for all of the stakeholders. Cost will be difficult to bear for some, while for others it might be a bit easier. How does that reflect on the approach to address the climate crisis, basically?
Yeah, that's true. I think neither the consequences will be evenly felt, neither the costs will and should be evenly in that sense distributed, given all the let's say elements that we previously discussed. But I think here what is also important to note that in addition to climate crisis that I think we're all very much aware of, there is another crisis that is equally important, equally valid, and also requires immediate action. And that's poverty crisis, because we have a huge percentage of world population that is basically, I would say, surviving, not necessarily living, because they lack essential services. There is a lack of healthcare, there is a lack of education, access to finance, access to energy. So this is an ongoing situation that, as I said, is equally valid. So actually, those countries, and this is primarily the developing world, so the level of development at which they currently are does not enable them to address climate change. It does not make them climate resilient. It does not increase their capacities to adapt to climate change. And they have already suffered substantially to adverse consequences of climate change. So basically, economic stability is one of the major, I would say, preconditions needed for those populations, those communities, especially disadvantaged people and groups within those populations, to increase their climate resilience and to adapt and to raise their capacities for adaptation. So economic stability means economic development, and economic development means actually an increase in emissions, because we've seen that through history. All the developed countries nowadays, have developed on the basis also of certain activities that generated GHG emissions. So one can expect that another development of another country now would also include GHG emission increase. But then again, we need to take into account that this increase that one can also, of course, in this aspect expect will start from already a very slow base. So if we were talking about, African countries and some other countries which have below 1 tons of CO2 per capita, and we're aiming 2.2, while there are some other countries which have, 15, 20, and even more. So we need to lift those people and populations out of poverty, and by doing that, and through development and economic stability, we're actually increasing their capacities to address climate change. So it's interconnected with climate change, and I would not, deprioritize poverty over climate crisis, definitely.
No, definitely, I agree with that they both of them feed very much into each other and need to be tackled in parallel. I think we could go on for quite another while because it's such a big and important topic to discuss, but I think I would also like to give the audience the platform to ask questions if there are any. Before we move to the Q&A, here's just a quick summary of what we've looked at now in this session. First of all, we had a historic look of who were the emitters in the past and how they've contributed to sort of the stock of global greenhouse gas emissions that are already in our atmosphere. We've looked at the difference between production-based and consumption-based emissions and how these affect the calculation when looking at where and how emissions are generated. And we also looked at the linkage between the poverty crisis and the climate crisis and how they feed into each other and need to be tackled in parallel to address both of these problems that we're currently facing. So now over to you, Franziska, to get any questions that we got from the audience.
We have indeed received some questions, and the first one would be, what are the challenges to achieving just transition and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, I would say a just transition is definitely a challenge because it means radical change. So I would group these challenges into three main groups: technological, economic, and sociological, social. Technological and economic are very much interlinked because a just transition to net zero basically entails not only deploying already mature technologies to achieve that goal, but in order to move that needle, what we need is innovative solutions. And these innovative solutions are something that requires, a lot of time and a lot of financial resources. And the pace at which we are supposed to actually deliver a net zero result is very, very fast. So that's one challenge, the timing and also financial resources to really develop these innovative solutions. However, I would say that the biggest challenge here is more of a social or sociological nature, because just transition actually means a change, and there is, something in human nature that simply resists to change, and this is a radical change. So this is not some smaller change that we, face on a daily basis. The way how we do business, our lifestyles, just transition requires all of this to radically change. We have seen benefits of our lifestyles and ways of doing things. We have embedded these ways for decades. So now changing that without even seeing immediate benefits of this change, I think will be one of the biggest challenges in the just transition.
Thank you for this insight. Here's to the next question. Who will actually pay for this just transition? Taxpayers in developed countries, governments, or who?
Everyone will pay. So here, absolutely everyone will pay this just transition. We can say, who we think should pay more and who should pay less, but in general, we will all pay. I would say that a lot of responsibility, of course, lies within governments, and there certain governments have made progress on that front. For example, within EU, we have a specially dedicated fund for just transition. But also, I would say other public and private organizations, private investors. When we were talking just now about these technological and economic challenges, I see, private investors really actually enabling those results. Yeah. So I believe they are very much important in this whole just transition. But it will also be paid by all of us on individual levels, because if not already, but we will surely in the near future will need to make daily changes, change our way of lifestyles, choices, everything. This most probably will come at a certain cost that is higher than the cost that we're accustomed, no? But yeah, so overall I would say we will all pay.
Indeed. Now to the last question. Which countries are leading the way and which ones are lagging?
So in terms of who leads the way in just transition, there is an organization, let's say, that does this just transition scoring. So if we take that into account, basically it shows the carbon or GHG efficiency of the social progress. So it combines social progress with consumption-based CO2 emissions per capita. And here, the leading countries, or I'll phrase it, regions, is Latin America and Europe. So they are one of the best countries when it comes to just transition, especially Costa Rica, Argentina. In Europe, it's Spain and Portugal and Sweden. And in terms of countries lagging behind are mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but that's mostly because they're not so carbon intensive. Of course, we know that, but the social progress is quite low, and that's why the score for them is also quite low in that sense. But they've made the most significant improvements over time.
Thank you so much for these insights. We are now coming to the end of the webinar. We actually didn't get to answer all of your questions, so Samuel will reach out to you separately. Thank you very much, Duška. Thank you, Samuel, and thank you for joining. For upcoming events, please follow us on LinkedIn. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.